people are joining us. The screen is filling up nicely. Okay. At the top of your screen, if it looks like mine, you can see that the recording has started. And once it's being made available, you can look at it as many times as you wish. Yeah, that's basically all that I can say. I see Samantha Gillian presence. There's a little cascade screen. Do you want to say something? It says send a quick message. Now, I don't know if I must send a quick message to what purpose. Samantha, are you there? Okay. I wonder if you did something on your side. Can you just cancel that? Okay, thanks a lot. I see there is still a camera on somewhere. I can see it on the icon here. Please just make sure that your camera is switched on. I mean, switched off. Okay, please. Yeah, the purpose of today's meeting really is just to give you a few pointers on assignment 2. But perhaps before we start with assignment 2, let us just review some of the major issues that have come up during the last couple of weeks. And of course, the major issue is one that unfortunately I cannot settle for you definitively because I simply don't know. And that has to do with the due date of assignment number 1. According to me, and according to the best information I have available, it was the 24th of May, but I still receive emails and WhatsApps and so on of students who are not certain when the due date is. Now, let me explain to you what is the problem with multiple choice assignment. The problem is that they are not marked within the department. So we are not in control of the portals that give you access to hand in your assignment or whatever the case may be. Always try and hand it in the normal prescribed manner. In other words, via MyUNISA. I mean, the system is not a mystery by now. And if it keeps on rejecting it, then contact either myself or Ms. Mavuso, and we will do our best to accommodate you. We have a firm policy in the department that any assignment sent in and received will be marked. So it is just for us not to have our wires crossed and so on. The reason why it is, especially, and now I'm talking about assignment number 2, why it is infinitely more productive for you to hand in by the union, by the usual channels. In other words, that is on MyUNISA, and then it gets displayed on this side on a thing we call the J router. Is then you are registered on the system. If something goes wrong with the assignment or whatever, I can then phone you and say, please send it again or send it directly. I can then mark it outside the J router, but then just finalize the point on the J router, and then you get your mark immediately. So it is just far more efficient to do it like that. Okay. The second assignment, the one we are going to deal with this afternoon, is the only written assignment in this module for 2021. And it consists of 2 questions. And the instruction is really quite explicit, but I know some of you have expressed that you are rather unfamiliar with the material, you're rather unfamiliar with the demands that some of the reading is putting on you, and I thought it would be not a bad idea if we could just exchange a few ideas. And by exchange, you are more than welcome to raise your hand. It will then show on my screen, and I will then, at a suitable moment in my own speaking opportunity, then ask you then to articulate your questions and so on. I don't want us to use the chat today because I am not adept enough at this whole business to stand here talking as well as monitor the chat room and so on. And as Ms. Mavusa is not going to be with us for the entire session, she also can't man the chat room. So if you have a comment to make or an interjection or a question, raise your hand and we will attend to it. It's also for the benefit of other students. And remember, there's no such thing as a stupid question. There are silly answers, yes, maybe, but any question is valid, and that is what you are supposed to be learning as well, and that is how to ask proper academically informed questions so we can get proper academically informed answers. Okay. I'm trying to get hold of the study material here. Assignment number 2. Let me just read it. I haven't seen a hand yet. Okay, so you're still waiting for me. Just bear with me. The assignment consists of 2 questions. Now, the question I get the most frequently is how long must it be? Okay. You must always remember that you are in this assignment supposed to address an issue. And after every single sentence that you write, you must ask yourself, have I moved closer to actually addressing the matter posed, or am I drifting off the point? This thing we call relevance. A lot of times I find assignments that are most beautifully appointed, they're multicolored, you know, Plascon would be proud of them, I'm sure, but they don't really address the issue at hand. So my major purpose is to try and clarify to you what the issue is without actually spoon feeding you. Now, I'm quite good at that. I'm quite good at suggesting things and not saying this is the way to do it. And it is not for me to tell you the way to do it. This is not an exercise in punishment. This is an exercise in teaching and learning. So you must always approach it from that point of view. Now, prolixity, as the lawyers would have it, is a cardinal academic sin as far as I'm concerned. And then the other side of it is there's brevity is next to godliness. But things can be so brief that it's difficult for the reader to understand what you are trying to say. And that brings me to another very important point. I have previously said you must ask yourself after every sentence, am I now addressing the question or not? Mr. Perumal, have you been doing something straight? Yeah, thank you, sir. You must just ask yourself, is what I've just said relevant? But the most important thing there is you must write in fully formulated sentences, okay? That has a verb. Okay, that's a simple way to put it. And a sentence that is reflexive. In other words, it is connected to what comes before it and what is going to follow after it. It goes without saying that brevity does not mean summary, okay? Because summaries doesn't have explanations, and that's the core of what you are supposed to do. And for you that have not yet actually connected the dots, if you read the study guide, study unit number 1, the one on visual illiteracy, all those guidelines that we suggest are actually sort of very practical things that you can apply and that will help you understand the image in front of you. And the image in front of us in this assignment is one single image that it is all about, and that is the Butcher Boys. So you have to familiarize yourself with the Butcher Boys. And so when you read these two articles, the one by Peffer and the one by Pick, you have that image in your mind, and you can. It's a kind of a one could almost say a kind of a relevancy test already while you're reading it, even if you read those articles for the first time. If you are quite familiar with the image, that will help you to form opinions and to form arguments and so on and so on. Okay. As I've said, I want your text to be rich in information, and it should be full of explanations. It shouldn't be a summary, and therefore it is difficult to say it should be 1,000 words per question, which means 2,000 words for the whole assignment, or it should be 4,000 or anything like that. But I can assure you, if you write a 4,000 word short essay, you must also remember the compelling practical parameters that I sit with this side. Okay, 800 students are registered for this module. You really think you're doing yourself a favor by writing 4,000 words per question? No. I've been marking assignments for 40 years. I can spot crap a mile away. Okay, the first paragraph, I know where I'm going. Okay, so do yourself the favor and really concentrate and try and for it to be as pointed as you possibly can. Okay, I will constantly, I hope, during this shortish presentation, refer to the study guide, and it is very important that you become familiar with the study guide, not because it has information, it's not written to be information rich, but because it tells you what to do when you are in front of a work of art. It also makes you alert to perhaps what the artist is saying and why that they are saying it in a certain manner. Not all artworks function with respect to the audience or to the spectator in the same way. The different ways an artwork functions is absolutely infinite. Okay. So question 1 reads, who are the South African artists identified and whose artworks are discussed by Peffer in his publication of 2009 that can be seen as the precursors of Jane Alexander? Briefly formulate the contribution to the development in figuration made by each according to Peffer. Okay. Now, just above the assignment question, it makes it clear. The focus is not on all the works of Jane Alexander, but on the Butcher Boys. Okay, so that's already a clear demarcation that you should keep in mind. Now let's analyze this question without referencing to any external information. The question clearly asks you to identify artists, and it asks you to identify the artist that Pfeffer discusses in his article. Okay, and so in other words, you have to provide the names of those artists, and because you can't just say and that artist influenced that other artist, you have to identify specific works, and they will have to be related. In other words, bring in relation to the Butcher Boys by Alexander. Okay, now it also qualifies that it said that can be seen as the precursor of Jane Alexander. Now I have a dictionary here with me, just to read to you what is the standard definition of a precursor. It says a precursor, to show, suggest, or announce by an antecedent type, image, or likeness. Or the second meaning, to picture or imagine beforehand. Okay, that first one is lovely because it says by an antecedent type, image, or likeness. Okay, so it's clear that what we are when we call those, when Pfeffer discusses those works, he actually invokes them because he has identified them as precursors. According to him, they can, and if it's not according to him, then it is according to me, those works can be understood in such a way that they have an interpretive impact on what we see in the Butcher Boys. Okay, the point I'm trying to make is that there are no artworks in the world that do not have antecedents, because all art is related to one another. Artists inform themselves in the strangest and the most wide-ranging way, and in this case, it is not different. But artists also, when they're fairly young, and always remember, Jane Alexander was still busy formally with her MA studies when she produced the Butcher Boys. She was in a discovery, exploring modality, and so on. So one would have imagined that she had this. She was pretty aware of the work that other artists were producing. Now, here is an interesting critical note that you can make. Okay, I don't think that Pfeffer discusses the issue of whether Jane Alexander was particularly aware of these specific artworks that he refers to. Okay, so the question then is a bit more tricky one. If she wasn't aware of it, then how could it have influenced her? Okay. It sounds as if it is an unsettling conundrum, but it is actually not. We're not talking about influence just by way of direct influence, which would also be kind of copying in a way. What we really mean by influence, as well as that particular meaning, is that the factors external to the artwork and internal to the art world works on artists in similar ways, so that they then start producing artworks with a certain subject matter, a certain theme, and in our case, where politics are so important in this country, with very similar messages and so on. Okay, so once you have a I see we've already had one leaving. Is it so boring? In any case, once you have identified those artists and the artworks, and you have tried to get decent images of them, you look on the internet, Google them, and so on. Then what you have to do is you then have to um, formulate very briefly, just by way of orientation, what those artworks are about and how they specifically relate then to the Butcher Boys of Jane Alexander. Okay, the last section of the question has as its main theme the issue of figuration. Okay, now what I'm going to do now is actually save you a little bit of research time by explaining to you what the link is and why figuration is so important. And in order to do that, we have to actually look a little bit backwards. In other words, starting at the Butcher Boys and then tracing it back to other examples and so on. Figuration is pretty important for two reasons. Okay, there were two major tendencies. The one major tendency was the one that Peffer is describing. He claims that under the impact of events like the Soweto uprising and more generally black consciousness, black artists responded by creating these hybrid figures, combinations of animals, combinations of human beings and animals, and so on. And according to Peffer, that really expresses the disquiet about identity. Mrs. D'Angelo, can you please turn off your camera? Okay, and in that trend that he maintains is the dominant modality, the dominant form of figuration in the late 70s and early 80s among black artists. He then identifies the history of that tendency. Now, the people that he mentions are Cecil Scottness, Egon Günther, and Sidney Kumalu. They were all involved in some way or the other with Poly Art Center, yeah, in Joburg. That was a government-sponsored institution to impart artistic skills to black people, and Scottness worked there and so on. So I don't know whether it is in fact the exclusive truth, but it is undoubtedly so that the mixing of different animal bodies and animal and human bodies and all kinds of creatures making these fantastic and phantasmagorical images is now so firmly implanted in our mind as being somehow typically African that it would really be quite a task to change that stereotype. Okay, but nevertheless, Peffer can in fact, and he does demonstrate that there is a certain developmental sequence in it. If you look, for instance, at some of the images of Sidney Khumalo, and Khumalo is a very, very well-known artist. You just Google him and you find multiple images and you know, scrutinize them, arrange them, see if there are dates, get a sequence going, and so on. And Khumalo is perhaps known best for that kind of mixed figure, but somehow those figures doesn't have a disquieting impact on the viewer. I'm not saying that they are benign, they are just unusual. That's really what I'm saying. However, then when we come to Esrom Lechai, then the animal-human hybrids become disturbing. And why are they disturbing? Because they sort of they push the register between what is real and possible and what is completely unreal and impossible. One can use the word unnatural. I don't think one should use the word monstrous, for instance, and so on. But it seems that there is a psychological anxiety that is beginning to creep in with the work of Lechai. And of course, that psychological anxiety is something that we find very pronounced, for instance, in the Butcher Boys. And in the Butcher Boys, that psychological disquiet has to do with the impossibility of actually defining what those three creatures are. They are clearly humanoid, but something else is happening there that makes it very difficult to simply pinpoint them as a merely human figures. We say humanoid because we seem to think there is either something more or there is something missing. They are not animals in the sense of the distinction between human beings and animals, despite the fact that they have these vestiges of animal features like horns and so on. So, but it is fairly underplayed. So it seems that one of the interesting issues that binds Lechai to, or let's keep to the terms of the question, that makes Lechai's work a precursor, a prefiguration of the Butcher Boys, is he raises the issue of human identity, not the identity of you and me as individuals, but he raises the question of what really is a human being. And then, of course, and this is the point that Peffer makes, he then asks the attendant questions, is this the way human beings are treated in apartheid South Africa? Okay. Then Dumile, or generally known as Feni, he's a more subtle artist. He's not so in your face like Lechai. Lechai one can't say he doesn't leave much room for imagination because it is all imagination. But Feni is also caught in these hybrid figures, but somehow the existential and the psychological features of this hybrid and mixture is more what interests him. Now, we all know that the Soweto uprising took place in 1976, and yet all these artists that I've mentioned so far were active and were established well before the Soweto uprising. Most of them carried on working, and Peffer makes the point that they were impacted by the events, and not only were they impacted, they were guided by black consciousness, that then sharpened their response, and it caused their the messages, the meanings in plural, and the messages of their artworks to sort of converge, that you can now talk about it as a discrete and a separate tradition. And at the core of that tradition is that, and this is where it becomes really interesting, because what Peffer is saying is that, drawing on a very old tradition of cultural habits and customs, the artists uses animals to assign certain symbolic meanings to them, and those symbolic meanings are the meanings that we can then see and decode in the images. Now that is interesting, because clearly when you look at the Butcher Boys, perhaps this aspect is not so prominent. But at least you should mention that it is not that prominent, and the reason for why that is, we can look at a later date. Okay, so that's the one artistic stream that was clearly present in the immediate context and in the immediate artistic context of Jane Alexander. But there was another one as well, and that was the international trends of the late 60s and early 70s. Peffer mentions the names of these artists like Siegel and so on, but maybe the easiest hook is Jane Alexander's teacher at Wits, and that's a man called Paul Stopforth. Okay, but if you look at the international scene, and and remember, those were the days that all the art schools in the country, I know that's when I started attending them as well, we pretty much followed an international curriculum. We were taught what was happening in America and in Western Europe and the rest of the art production of the world, including the local South African art production, was not really very well featured within the mix of what students were taught. So Jane was definitely well aware of the different trends internationally, and the main trend is perhaps what we would call pop art and minimalistic art and conceptual art that came through and so on. What was interesting about those arts, they were all non-representational. In other words, they didn't depict things or people or animals, or they were not narrative, they didn't tell a story and so on. But there were also artists like Siegel who reacted against this abstract notion of art production and so on. And they really wanted to try and explore the way that the human body is experienced in an artwork. Okay. In other words, they were concerned about notions like beyond beauty, for instance, trying to disrupt the normal flow of emotions, because that's really what identification really means. When you look at a depiction of another person, it is sort of affirming your own identity and so on. But they didn't want to stop depicting the human body. What they wanted to do, or I don't know whether they really wanted to do it like that, because it's quite impossible, as art is communication, and so they wanted to disrupt the the flow of communication between looking at a human body and responding to it in the old traditional way. So they would make these strangely mysterious and passive figures, people standing in a queue, people standing in front of a shelf in a supermarket and so on. They're not doing anything. They do not seem to be really much aware of their surroundings and so on and so on. And I think Pfeffer perhaps underplays the importance of this tendency that she was definitely exposed to as a young artist and so on. Okay, so then we can I just want to quickly say something about the Butcher Boys as well, because it goes back to the study guide and study unit 1. One of the guidelines that we suggest is the fairly tautologist one that says emotions and feelings are guides to an artwork. In other words, artworks are very seldom about emotions and feelings, okay? And you should also not approach an artwork with the notion of now that you should be gushing forth all this emotional nonsense, okay? You should approach an artwork in a cerebral, conceptual manner. In other words, ask what it is about, and that's the guideline of aboutness, of course, but I don't want to talk about that. What is happening in the Butcher Boys is when you look at that installation for the first time, and even if you Google it and you see all the multiplicity of images and so on, you really ask yourself, what am I seeing? What really am I looking at? It's not a positive, resolved identification that you make. The hook that she hooks you with is you don't actually know what you are looking at. And therefore you have to start exploring it. And at the end of that exploration process, you come to the point of where you as a spectator become emotionally involved. In other words, you are energized or appalled or concerned or whatever the right word might be about what she appears to be saying. Okay. Now, I've given you hints when discussing these other artists, and I haven't referred to specific examples, but I think the hints are nevertheless there. Most of the things that I've said you can directly or invertedly find in the Jane Alexander. And that's what I think you should try really and do, is in fairly simple terms, try and relate these images to what you see in the Butcher Boys. Now, there is not a correct way of doing it. If you're not sure, you must say so. You say, I'm not sure, but I think because I see this and I see this and I read this in Pfeffer and I read this somewhere else, that this may not be a far-fetched idea. What am I explaining to you? What I am explaining to you is to argue like that, okay, is to adduce evidence, is to explain why you make a certain proposal, why you assert something. And you just can't assert something because you feel like it, okay? So there's always a reason why you have certain emotional responses. But Alexander is particularly clever in manipulating our emotional response in this artwork. It's first to disrupt our very clear response to it, and then in the exploration come to other insights about what it is saying and what it is proposing. And that is what makes her work so compelling. It is without a doubt still in 2021. It is still the most important single artwork produced in South Africa in the last 60 years. No doubt about that. Okay. And that in itself should tell us something about its importance. There's something flashed to my mind. That's an unusual event, I must say, lately, but I can't remember it now. I'll come back to it when we talk about the second question. Okay, I've been going for about half an hour now. Tell me, are there any questions that you want to ask? Have you spotted all the contradictions in what I'm saying? Are you awake? Please give me a thumbs up, one or two, please. Okay, thank you. Thank you. I've got 2 thumbs up. Wonderful. 3, 4, and a clap of the hands as well. I'm glad to see you are still awake. Still, do you have any questions that you want to ask? Can I ask you, have you in fact read that book chapter by John Peffer? Nicole, you want to ask something?
Yes. I read it, and I read all of the suggested readings, and it was very unsettling, and I felt very uncomfortable. And it's I don't know how I'm supposed to write the assignment questions, because she's definitely given me a feeling, and I'm feeling some feelings that are just a lot. And it's wow, she really did what she was supposed. She made the artwork talk to you, but it's hard to. I'm finding it hard to absorb all the information that comes from all the artwork and the artists that have gone before and after her. So I'm glad we're having this, because I'm really struggling to figure out how to actually answer the questions.
Okay, now,
Yes.
well, thanks for your question, because I think it gives me the opportunity to also to also just make another point that is very important, is that there is no such thing as a complete and perfect answer. Okay, that is not what I'm trying to teach you. What I'm rather trying to teach you is that whatever opinion you hold, you have based that on some evidence. Now, when I listen to you, Nicole, what I hear is exactly where you are supposed to start. See, why do you have this unsettling, uncomfortable apprehension when you look at it? You know, the next article we're going to look at by Tenley Bick, and also the article by Mercer, explains exactly, or according to them, in exact terms as is possible, why we have this identification and non-identification simultaneously. Why are we attracted, fascinated, and repulsed at the same time? You see, so to me, that's a very valid initial response, and I maintain that is exactly what Jane Alexander tried to do, and we can use this insight, I think, that you've demonstrated as an entry into the second question, because the second question also looks at precursors of the Butcher Boy, but it is the artwork that she made herself. And then just on this point of whether things are undefined, grotesque, abject are the two fancy words that get thrown about in the literature. Then you can see of the works that came before the Butcher Boys, they do not present one with this kind of irresolution that you find in the Butcher Boys. And this is what makes, to my mind, the Butcher Boys really a work of genius, because to be able to manipulate the viewer so precisely, so exactly, so smartly is really quite an achievement. And it's even more of an achievement if you imagine how that she was quite a young person at that time, you know, because it's perhaps easier to make something that is in your face, but it is very difficult to keep someone engaged when they've already experienced revulsion. So she prevents us from turning our back on that artwork, and us, especially us South Africans, we are really forced to look at that artwork, and we are set to wonder, what is it all about? And that means for us, what is it saying to us about us? And what is it saying about the spectator, which must be us? Because this is the context in which she did produce the work. Okay. Anyone else want to ask a question? Okay. Okay, let's sort of carry on then with the second assignment, or the second question of the assignment. Let me just read it to you. Question 2. Okay. It beeped here on my side, but I can't see a hand. Okay. It says big, meaning tenly big, in 2010, which is a year after the publication of the Peffer book. And that is important because we must assume that Bick was fully informed about what Peffer wrote. Okay, illustrates and discusses 4 other artworks by Jane Alexander that either predates the Butcher Boy slightly or is closely associated with it in figuration, thematics, and period. Explain in your own words how Bick argues the relationship between each of them and the Butcher Boys. Now, I've really already answered that question more or less in my answer to Nicole's remark. But if you have perhaps in front of you this article, Horror Histories, okay? Do any one of you have it in front of you? Not? Okay, it's a bit of a pity because, yeah, thank you. Let me just show you some of the illustrations. There is the Butcher Boys, and there's a detail from the back. Okay, none of this is difficult to get hold of. You just Google the Butcher Boys Jane Alexander and you will get hundreds of images. So, but this is where it gets interesting. She also illustrates this work, Domestic Angel, in its own way, a pretty unsettling work as well, I suppose. And this one that is truly revolting is called Untitled, and it shows the front and the back of a male seated figure. Okay, just so that you can have a slight impression of what it looks like, and then one that is really very close. I'm trying to look. Okay, that's the one. That one is called the Municipal Crucifix, and it bears a lot of elements that are quite easy to spot that you find repeated in the Butcher Boys. Okay, but when you look at these images closely, and I mean, I'm not going to, what I'm doing is really not a summary of the article. You must still read the article. This is just a kind of a pointer and so on. Okay. But when you look at the first one that I showed you, Domestic Angel, it is, I don't want to be dismissive, but it's rather trite. It's a figure with wings, I guess, and that is where the notion of angel comes from. The notion domestic is maybe a little bit problematic, but we can speculate that it is maybe the very opposite of glamorous. And it figures it figures a nude figure, feet tied up, suspended from the ceiling, and so on. And I think what Alexander was trying to do in this work still, and remember we are now talking about student work here, she was really trying to address the issue of bodiliness and sexuality, the issue of nudity as titillation and so on. And why I find that interesting is a lot of times I read in assignments and things and so on that the nudity in the Butcher Boys and the covering up of the genitals are some kind of a allusion to human sexuality gone wrong, or so on and so on. However, the way I look at it is, if you look at this Domestic Angel, that is actually the point where Alexander decided that she was not interested to pursue this particular aspect of figuration, of human figuration, any further. It was, in fact, jettisoned along the wayside. Okay. But when you get to this one, there is another emphasis that we also find in the Butcher Boys, but here the response of revulsion is complete. Okay, it is not mitigated or softened by any form of doubt or questioning and so on. This obese creature is just too horrible to really look at. In fact, it is disgusting. It's as simple as that. Okay. And then when you get to this, it is another interesting index that these figures, they also sit on a bench, and they also don't communicate with one another, but they are strangely disenlivened. That's the only way to say it. They're strangely dead. Yeah, what can we say? You know, they are only what you can see, and but nevertheless, I think there is an aspect that she took over to the Butcher Boys, which is namely the aspect of non-communication. That's the thing that strikes us when we look at the Butcher Boys. Those three figures are not communicating with one another. And it is, I think, a fairly fruitless exercise to try and figure why there are three or how many of them and so on, and why are they not talking to one another and stuff like that. One of the reasons, of course, is opens up another can of worms, and it's really a big can of worms, that at the original display of the Butcher Boys, these three figures were facing another one, a little bit like the previous one that was sitting on a chair, uh, facing them. And even in that setup, it wasn't clear that there was any communicative intent that she had, but it changes the Butcher Boys in a narrative sense very, very fundamentally. But I don't want you to go down that route for the present exercise. So you see, if we look at these three images that came before the Butcher Boys, we can see where she discusses things and then discards them. And she explores things and she takes it over and then emphasizes them uh, elsewhere. But a synthesis of all these things, including a rejection of sexuality or sexual titillation, including the rejection of a simple preponderance of revulsion and that leads to rejection that causes a spectator to say, not I. This is dissimilar from me, and immediately you are not only emotionally but also intellectually distanced from what the message is. Okay, and then this thing of a lack of communication between the figures that necessarily disrupts, in this case, the narrative flow. Okay, so that was a bit briefer than I thought it would be, but that is more or less, I think, what needs to be said. Maybe as a final remark is there are two words, I've mentioned them before, that appear to be very fashionable. It was certainly very fashionable in the early 1990s when this work was still being quite hotly discussed, and of course afterwards. It's interesting for those of you who are interested in such things. Both John Peffer as well as Stanley Bick are Americans. The reason why I'm giggling is because it's just one of those curses of being a South African historian or art historian, is people from outside the borders of this country will always come and tell you what is going on in your own country. Okay, that's now my little nasty aside for the afternoon, and we will stay with that. But the words grotesque and abjection means are quite different words. They have different etymologies, in other words, where they come from and how one should use them. But I don't want you to get lost in the linguistics of where these terms come from. What they do share is this this notion of the undefinability of things, okay, which is quite an important notion to grasp, and because that is actually where our engagement with this artwork starts. It starts at that point where we say, I don't know, let's look at it further. Clearly, that's why you are registered for this module. You want to be more informed about art. You want actually to hold and have opinions and express them that are responsible and that will be recognized as someone speaking that has got more than just a superficial knowledge of what they are talking about. And therefore, for you, it's clearly a natural assumption that I can make is that is what you would like to be able to do. Okay. Okay, so again, any questions? Any remarks? Not? Okay. Yes. Hello. Hello. Speak up, please.
Hello?
Yes, please.
Hi, sorry, Prof. When you were discussing the domestic angel, you broke up quite a bit.
Oh,
And I don't know if everyone else, but I lost what you said when you said she moved away from
yeah.
something.
Yeah, I think what
Yes.
I think what the domestic angel explores, if you want, what it is about. Okay, according to Barrett, and let's stick to his guidelines. If you ask yourself what is the aboutness of domestic angel, among other things, it is undoubtedly this question of female nudity that in the Western art tradition elicits sexual titillation. Okay, that's why we talk about nude painting and not the painting of naked women or naked men. That's a little bit too obvious, you see. And I think she um, she didn't continue with that particular exploration of female nudity and so on. She made other things that is not in this article. She made other figures um, that are quite grim and disturbing along the same lines, but they were, um, they, for a lack of a better word, they still a bit crude, can one say? Too obvious, too openly critical of the traditional, they typical exploratory works. And my reading of Domestic Angel is that it is her exploration of female bodiliness and therefore female sexuality, not as something in itself, but how it figures in art. Remember, was part of an MA project, and that is something she did not um, explore any further than Domestic Angel. So the question then arises, or let's put it like that, the conclusion automatically arises that she then desisted from doing it. I said that she then discarded this as a viable sub-theme in exploring figuration. Okay, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Okay, righto. Yeah, all I can say is if you, oh, there is another hand up. Uh, I can't, the icon is not displayed on the screen, but I see a hand. Yes, if anyone has still has a question, just click on your mic and speak up. I think it is Mrs. D'Angelo. Mrs. D'Angelo, please.
Hello, Professor. It's Laura.
Oh, I cannot hear a thing. You have to sit closer to your mic.
Okay, I'm working from a laptop screen right now. Can you hear me?
Yeah, very, very faintly, but okay.
So I was just wondering, with Jan Alexander in particular, what I found very interesting, because I've always been very interested in her work, and obviously being South African, you're exposed a lot to that if you'd studied it or gone to the museum or anything like that. And with the sexuality that she depicts, there was one specific one I was trying to find and remember. Maybe some other people know it in the class, which is where she actually went and interviewed prostitutes, and she had a whole series and range. And there was one where there's a woman bent over with cash between her legs, and it's sort of, and I think the title was sort of like "Come and Get It" sort of thing. Sorry, that's my dog. I'm so sorry. She wants to participate. So can we maybe draw a line between those two? Could we possibly I mean, she's also crude in that respect, but at the same time, she also takes away the stigma of she humanizes, because I don't think that everyone particularly or necessarily thinks that or regards prostitution or people who are prostitutes as human themselves when we think about it. There's a lot of judgment that comes with it.
Okay.
And could we make that correlation of her work like that? Could we make that correlation that she continued to do that?
Yeah, I'm yeah, the last bit, the last sentence or two that you've said, I'm not sure that I understand it correctly, but nevertheless, I think, remember, when I started off, I said that everything we do is in the perspective or from the perspective of the butcher boys, you understand? And one of the issues that always come up is about this thing of the covered genital and, you know, then the sort of the general nudity and so on. And what I'm saying is, if you read back, that domestic angel is the point where her interest in that kind of thing lapsed. Okay. And it was not carried forward into the butcher boys. What you're saying about those other figures and installations that she made, and she also made a number of prints, photography-based prints and so on, is perfectly valid in their own right. But remember, we're focusing on the butcher boys and not on those other images per se in their own right. Understand?
Yes, I do understand. Thank you, Professor.
Okay, fine, thanks. Okay, there was another question. There was another question. I can't see the. Yeah. Mrs. De Angelis, can you just put your hand down so we can it's just easier for me then to spot the other hands that are up. Okay, there are no other questions. Yeah. Okay. Miss Nino, your hand was up for a flash and then you took it down.
Hi, Prof. I did ask my question. I was the first one.
Yeah. Yes, I know, but that is why I'm asking. Okay, because your hand just flashed
No.
and so on.
Okay, sorry. I don't know why. Thank you.
Okay, so all that remains for me is to again invite you, if you need more attention or you want to discuss these things with me or any matter of the other assignments or so on. I don't know the vagaries of the pandemic that we are in, but I'm at the office every day, and I know for a fact that students are again allowed on campus, and you are more than welcome to come and see me, make an appointment. And yeah, sometimes it helps just to have a 10-minute discussion face to face to clarify certain things. I've seen it so many times, because paper and words, whatever we think of it, is actually rather a blunt instrument when it comes to communication and so on. Okay, so thanks for your time and your patience, and I wish you the best of luck. And also remember, please visit my UNISA regularly, because we'll be hosting another feedback session, a feedback session on assignment number 1. And then we'll have a feedback session on assignment number 2. And with a little bit of luck, I'll be going down to Durban and to Cape Town for contact sessions with the students, if we can get the logistical arrangements finalized. Okay, thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Have a good weekend.
Thank you. I'll do.